Hello and welcome to Scholastically Natalie. If you're interested in writing, reading, D&D, this is your place. Feel free to subscribe or leave a like if you enjoy this video. So, if you have spent time on this channel, you will notice that we are having a bit of a different look and titling situation. That's because I'm actually using a PowerPoint I made for my student teaching. I'm gonna be honest about it, man. I taught a unit on dialogue and how to make it realistic in a story. Maybe you'll find this useful, maybe you won't. So, this is to talk about how you can make dialogue be realistic in a story. So, number one, you really have to pay attention to the rules of dialogue, which can be a bit hard to keep track of. If you do it often enough, it helps. So, for instance, if somebody talks, you should be starting a new paragraph. Each paragraph should be indented, and punctuation for what is said goes inside the quotation marks. Long speeches with several paragraphs don't have end quotes, so if, for instance, you have a paragraph, a second paragraph, and a third paragraph, the first and second paragraph wouldn't have end quotes. And then, if the person is speaking and quoting somebody inside their quotes, you use one set of quotes, the apostrophe. So that can be a bit to swallow, I will admit, so I did have some instances for us to practice. So, it seems that you're right, Josh said, a frown creasing his forehead. What is wrong with this sentence? It is the fact that that period should have been a comma, because you can't end a statement inside quotes. It has to be a comma. If the dialogue tag, which is the whole Josh said aspect, that dialogue tag, if it's after your quote, you have to have a comma to it. Rules of dialogue, generally I like to think of it as, you're not done with that thought. How did you know? Jenny asked. So the issue here is that we didn't have that question mark inside of the quotes. This is different from having to replace the period with a comma, because this is showing the question is only within those quotations. The portion that says Jenny asked isn't a question, it's a statement, so that should have a period. This seems to me, Arthur mused, rather dangerous. And what we have there is that should be a comma to the dialogue tag. Now you can move on from a dialogue tag if you're splitting it, if you're splitting the statement with a dialogue tag, several ways. I've seen it done a couple different ways. People have done it with a semicolon, people have done it with a colon, some people put a period and then just continue it. I've seen it a couple different ways. Okay, so then next we have to talk about believable dialogue, which is, after you've mastered the general dialogue, something that you really do have to consider. So, one, you need to use your dialogue to move the story forward. Either in some way, like your subplots, if you're trying to have some character have an arc, you need to express that with the dialogue, or use the dialogue to get the story going, or to move it forward without having to constantly describe things, unless it's your style. So, you just don't need extraneous dialogue. For instance, I shouldn't have to listen to, hello, how's your day? Oh, my day's been wonderful. Like, your dialogue should have a purpose. Secondly, you should definitely break your dialogue up with action. I know that, like, in the classics, people don't really do this, and if you're going for, like, a more simplistic writing style, that doesn't always happen. But it's always good to have your dialogue tag followed by some sort of description as to what they're doing. Occasionally, not every single one, because then it's kind of overwhelming, but you want to be able to have a lot of speech accompanied with an action to express, like, the subtext if you're trying to imply things, so that, people can catch on to what's really going on in a situation. And then thirdly, you do want to vary the use and the placement of speech tags. it can get really boring to just have Joseph said, Joseph said, Joseph said, Joseph said. Now, you don't want to replace every single said, because sometimes it lets us relax, it lets us not have to think too much. But if you're trying to say somebody said something excitedly, instead of using that ly modifier, you can just say they exclaimed, they shouted, they yelled, they crowed, depending on what sort of connotation you want. If you don't know what connotation is the kind of feeling that a word gives the reader. It's not the same as a definition, or a denotation, because that is literally the dictionary definition. So like if I say yelled, I might say that it means like a loud use of your voice. But sometimes, depending on where you're using it, it can be an expression of anger, or it can be an expression of excitement, depending on the situation, and that would be the connotation of that word. So, you do want to use different speech tags. I personally don't want to read a, 25 chapter novel that just has Amy said, Josh said, Joseph said. Like, I'm not that interested. I want you to engage me. So if somebody's sad, maybe they're whispering, like, just something to give me a little bit more oomph in the moment. And then by placement, I mean, split your dialogue sometimes. Put the dialogue tag in front of your speech if you're like ending a paragraph with it. Give us some variety. Fourth, you are going to want to modify that dialogue to match the pace of your story. So if you're in the middle of an action scene, you don't want long, flowery dialogue, because that makes no sense. You want rushed, hurried dialogue getting cut off. You want that to match things. Maybe somebody's blurting something out, maybe somebody's yelling, maybe somebody's screaming. You want that thing that sets where you're at in your story. And maybe if your characters are like having a nice dinner, they're just gonna have like casual dialogue. They're not gonna use big words. They might just be chit-chatting about their days. They might, have some inside jokes. And additionally, if they're in an academic setting, they're gonna be speaking a certain different way when interacting with their professors. If they're interacting with teachers, like, they might use bigger words. If they're at work, I could go on. And then lastly, you want to give characters a distinct voice. You want them to have a certain way of speaking. If I'm writing two different characters, and one's a professor and one's a high school student, my professor's going to talk differently than my high school student. My professor's going to use academic language. They're going to use big words. They might start lecturing, whereas a high school student's probably going to use more modern slang. They're going to use just like chill words. They're not going to be trying too hard to impress somebody or prove their knowledge, right? They're chill. So let's try editing some sentences. So, I cannot believe that took place, Joe scoffed, scrolling through his Twitter feed. So, there's a different edit. So I can't believe that happened. Because, again, Joe is scrolling through Twitter, so clearly he's some sort of modern person. And generally a modern person shortens their sentences. They tend to use contractions. They don't need to elaborate as much. So then, how can you not have heard of this? Hannah demanded, brandishing her keychain. You haven't heard? Hannah demanded. Any sort of variety just to shorten it, to leave the conversation open, because for this sentence, you limit your replies, whereas for you haven't heard, you leave room for them to kind of explain themselves. Then, what are you doing in my house? The ghost boomed. So that doesn't seem very intimidating, honestly. If somebody was booming that at me, I don't know if I'd be super freaked out. But who dares enter my home does sound a lot more frightening, right? And then, lastly, if you are ever in doubt, read it out loud. I'm pretty sure I've told you guys this before, but I did spend the majority of my fiction writing class reading pretty much all of my stories out loud to my rather unfortunate roommate at the time. She put up with it very well, though. And I mean, even the year before that, creative writing, I was reading stories to my roommate, asking her if things made sense, and even coming up with jokes with her, seeing if things that I wrote were actually funny. because I am a rather sarcastic person, and sometimes that does not come off well in paper. So I really do think reading it out loud, even to yourself, is good, but to another person is like a whole nother level of useful. But reading it out loud, I catch myself repeating words too often. I find myself going, that doesn't really make sense. And I've had my friends do that. I've read out loud to them, and they've said, don't understand that at all. And I'm like, oh no. But I hope you enjoyed this talk about dialogue. Hopefully it gave you some sort of assistance. Let me know if you enjoy this more teachy kind of video, or if you'd prefer just chit-chatting about things I've done, or things that I have a bit of an opinion about. I find dialogue to be one of the things that really can either off-put me or make me really excited in stories. Too often I've read either like fanfiction or self-published novels where each character sounds exactly the same, like, you know, a 60-year-old professor sounds the exact same as like an 11-year-old child, and I'm like, that's not really how that goes. So let me know how you feel about my dialogue explanations, if they made sense, if you think I'm a pretentious idiot for having to explain this to you. So feel free to leave a comment, leave a like. If you're super interested, please subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at ScholasticallyNatalie, and, you know, we might have a good time. So, thanks for sticking around, and I will see you all later. Scholastically Natalie,